Welcome back, dreamers. Tonight, we're unmasking the worst rulers history ever saw. Kings and queens who made life a nightmare for their people. Tyrants who crushed hope, sparked rebellions, and ruled with cruelty that still sends chills. From brutal laws to selfish greed, these monarchs shaped dark chapters filled with fear, famine, and fury. Think you've seen bad leadership? Wait until you hear what they got away with. Before we dive in, hit like, subscribe, and drop a comment. Where are you watching from? And what's the worst boss you've ever had? Now, settle in. Keep your eyes open and prepare to meet the worst of the worst. In the shadow of Rome's marble columns and gilded palaces, a new emperor rose to power, and his name was Caligula. Let me be real with you here. The stories of Caligula are almost too wild to believe, and yet they have echoed through the centuries like a warning whispered in the dark. His rule was a storm of madness and cruelty, a theater of nightmares that turned Rome's proud capital into a stage where every performance was paid for in blood. Some people swear that the cruelty of Caligula was a reflection of the empire itself, that he was both its creation and its curse. But I think when you peel back the layers of power and ambition, what you find is something far more terrifying: a man who saw no difference between a throne and a slaughterhouse. At first glance, it might seem like Caligula was simply drunk on the power of the empire. He was young and handsome, and for a moment Rome believed he might be the leader they had been waiting for. But power has a way of twisting even the strongest hearts, and in Caligula, it found a perfect vessel for its darkest desires. Could be nothing, but the way he used his power was like a child smashing a toy, a game played with human lives. And as he played, the city of Rome watched in horror, because in his games there was no mercy and no escape. Imagine the grand feasts that filled his palace, the tables piled high, with delicacies from every corner of the empire, the music sweet and haunting in the flickering torchlight. The guests reclined on silken couches, their laughter forced and brittle, because they knew that at any moment a single word or glance could bring the emperor's wrath crashing down on their heads. Caligula would raise his cup in a toast, his eyes gleaming with a light that was half madness and half delight. He would smile as he ordered executions for after-dinner entertainment, turning the palace halls into a place where death was just another amusement. You know what's even stranger? It was not enough for Caligula to command life and death. He wanted to own every pleasure, every secret, every flicker of fear in the hearts of those around him. He took other men's wives without a second thought, not out of love or even lust, but out of sheer boredom, a casual cruelty that left every husband in Rome trembling. It is just odd how power can make a man forget the difference between a lover and a trophy, between a wife and a conquest. Let me be real with you. Here in Caligula's Rome, there was no love-only possession, and the echoes of laughter that was never truly joyful. Anyway, back to the point. Caligula did not just play with the bodies of his subjects, he played with their souls. He declared himself a living god, demanding temples be raised in his name and statues carved in his likeness. Some people swear that he would stand in the temple dressed in robes of gold, his voice echoing in the sacred halls as he proclaimed his divinity. Could be nothing, but I think there was something almost pitiful in that madness. a man who wanted to be more than mortal but could only find emptiness in his own reflection. Imagine the terror that clung to every corner of his court, the way even the smallest whisper could become a death sentence. The senators who once walked proudly through the forum now moved like shadows, their voices low, their eyes always on the floor. The slaves who served at his table learned to smile without ever meeting his gaze, because they knew that a single slip of the tongue could cost them everything. Let me be real with you here. It was a world where loyalty meant nothing, where the only thing that mattered was the emperor's whim and the cold glitter of his laughter. You know what's even stranger? Some people say that Caligula was not born mad, that the endless weight of power twisted his mind until there was nothing left but hunger and hate. And maybe that is true, because even the strongest man can be broken when the world around him is built on fear. It is just odd how the same people who once cheered his name in the streets now lived in terror of his gaze. Could be nothing, but I think that says more about the nature of power than it does about Caligula himself. Anyway, back to the point. In those years of madness and cruelty, Rome became a place where no one felt safe. The statues of the gods watched with cold eyes as feasts turned to bloodbaths, and every night was a new nightmare. Caligula ruled with a hand that was both playful and merciless, a child's cruelty in a man's body. Some people swear that he was a demon in human form, but I think the truth is even more unsettling. He was a man who saw no difference between life and death, between a crown and a dagger. Imagine the fear that must have lived in every heart, the way the city's laughter always seemed to die a little too quickly. The way the senators' hands trembled as they raised their cups, the way the slaves learned to move like ghosts in the halls of a palace that smelled of incense and blood. Let me be real with you here. It was not just Caligula's madness that made those nights so terrible. It was the way his madness became a mirror for everyone else, showing them just how fragile their world really was. You know what's even stranger? Some people swear that in the end, even Caligula's own bodyguards turned on him, that the man who declared himself a god was cut down by those he had once commanded. And maybe that is the final lesson of his reign, that power built on fear is always doomed to fall. Could be nothing, but I think it is worth remembering, because in the end, no matter how brightly the lamps burned in the emperor's halls, the light was always just a breath away from darkness. So was Caligula a product of power, or the very definition of its corruption? I do not have the answer, and maybe that is the point. Because in the shadows of his feasts, in the flicker of torches on marble walls, we see the truth that power is both a gift and a curse, a dream that can turn to a nightmare in the blink of an eye. And in the end, all that remains is the echo of laughter that was never quite real, the ghost of a man who wanted to be a god and found only madness in the mirror. In the cold heart of Russia, there once lived a ruler whose name still sends shivers down the spine of history, Ivan IV, known to the world as Ivan the Terrible. Let me be real with you here. This was not just a king with a bad temper or a ruler who let his power go to his head. Ivan was a man whose rage consumed everything in its path, a fire that burned through the soul of a kingdom until there was nothing left but ashes and fear. Some people swear that he was born under a cursed star, that his soul was marked by darkness from the moment he drew his first breath. But I think when you look at the choices he made, the terror he unleashed, what you see is a man who became the very monster he was meant to protect his people from. At first glance, it might seem like Ivan's rule was just another chapter in the long, bloody history of kings and conquerors. He was young and brilliant, a man who could read the ancient texts and speak with the silver tongue of a poet. He dreamed of a Russia that would be strong and united, a kingdom that would stand tall against its enemies. But power has a way of turning even the brightest dreams into nightmares, and in Ivan's case, that darkness grew like a cancer until it swallowed everything in its path. Could be nothing, but I think the seeds of that madness were always there, waiting for the moment when the world would turn its back and leave him alone with his own fears. Imagine the icy streets of Moscow in winter, the snow piled high against the wooden walls, the air so cold it could steal the breath from your lungs. The people huddled in their homes, whispering prayers to saints and spirits, hoping that the Tsar's anger would pass them by. But Ivan's rage was like a storm that never ended, and no prayer, no plea could hold it back. Some people swear that he would walk the halls of his palace in the dead of night, his eyes wild with visions of betrayal and blood. Let me be real with you. Here it is, a kind of madness that leaves no room for mercy, no space for hope. You know what's even stranger? Ivan did not fight his battles alone. He had the oprichniki, his black-robed enforcers, who rode like shadows through the frozen streets. They were his fists, his knives, his unblinking eyes, and they carried his will with a kind of zeal that was almost holy in its fury. It is just odd how men can find a kind of faith in cruelty, how the promise of power can turn even the humblest soul into a monster. The oprichniki wore black from head to toe, their faces hidden beneath cold iron masks, and in their hands they carried the tools of torment. Some people swear that the sound of their horses' hooves was enough to make strong men weep, and I think there is a terrible kind of truth in that. Anyway, back to the point. Ivan's fury fell hardest on the city of Novgorod, a place that had dared to stand apart to question the Tsar's absolute rule. The stories say that the rivers ran red with blood, that the ice cracked and groaned beneath the weight of bodies thrown into its freezing depths. Entire families drowned their cries, lost beneath the roar of water and the cold laughter of the men who served Ivan's will. Let me be real with you. Here it is, one of those horrors that clings to the bones of history, a reminder that the line between a king and a butcher can vanish in a single breath. Imagine the terror that must have lived in every heart, the way mothers held their children, closed their eyes dark, with the knowledge that no door, no prayer could keep them safe. The priests who walked the streets with their crosses held high the merchants who once filled the markets with laughter. All of them learned the same cruel lesson, that Ivan's rage was a hunger that could never be sated. Could be nothing, but I think that is the true measure of his madness, the way it devoured not just his enemies, but the very soul of his kingdom. You know what's even stranger? Some people swear that Ivan's fury was driven by visions that only he could see, that the walls of his palace echoed with the voices of ghosts and demons who whispered lies and promises in the dark. And maybe that is true, because the human mind is a fragile thing, and power can break it as easily as glass. Let me be real with you. Here it is. Just odd how the same man who built churches and wrote prayers could also order the deaths of thousands with a flick of his hand. It is a contradiction that speaks to something deeper in the heart of every ruler, the way love and hate can be twisted together, until they are no longer separate at all. Anyway, back to the point. Ivan's reign was a storm that never ended, a darkness that swallowed every light in its path. The Oprichniki rode through the night, their black banners snapping in the wind, their laughter sharp as knives. And in the great halls of the Kremlin, Ivan watched it, all his eyes bright with a kind of fever that was both glory and madness. Some people swear that he saw himself as a god, that he believed his fury was a holy fire meant to purify the world. Could be nothing, but I think in the end it was just a man lost in the echo of his own rage, a king who forgot that power is meant to protect, not to destroy. Imagine the silence that fell when the Oprichniki were gone, when the black robes and iron masks vanished into the cold mists of history. The people of Russia rose from their knees, their voices trembling as they spoke of the days when death rode through the streets with Ivan's name on its lips. Let me be real with you here. It was a kind of healing, but the scars ran deep, and the memory of those nights would never truly fade. Because in the end, a kingdom is not just its walls and its fields, it is the hearts of the people who live there, and Ivan's rage had left those hearts cracked and bleeding. So, how did a man meant to protect his kingdom become the monster who devoured it? I do not have the answer, and maybe that is the point. Because in Ivan's story we see the truth that power can be both a shield and a blade, and that the line between protector and predator is as thin as ice on a winter river. In the end, all that remains is the echo of the Oprichniki's laughter, the shadow of a king who burned his own kingdom to feed the fire in his soul. In the heart of Madagascar, a queen once ruled with a grip so tight it choked the life from her people. Her name was Ranavalona I, and her reign from 1828 to 1861 turned an island paradise into a land of fear and death. Some called her the Mad Queen, others the Queen of Death. But behind the titles was a woman whose paranoia and cruelty reshaped a nation. At first glance, Ranavalona's rise to power seemed almost inevitable. Born Ramavo in 1778, she was married to King Radama I, who had modernized Madagascar and opened it to European influence. But when Radama died without an heir, Ramavo seized the throne, declaring herself queen and taking the name Ranavalona. She quickly eliminated any rivals, securing her position through blood and fear. Ranavalona's rule was marked by a fierce commitment to preserving traditional Malagasy culture and resisting foreign influence. She viewed Christianity and European customs as threats to her authority and the island's sovereignty. In 1835, she banned the practice of Christianity, expelled missionaries, and persecuted converts. Churches were destroyed, and those who refused to renounce their faith faced imprisonment, torture, or execution. One of the most notorious aspects of her reign was the use of the Tangina ordeal, a traditional trial by poison. Accused individuals were forced to consume a mixture made from the Tangina nut, which was highly toxic. If they vomited up the poison and 3 pieces of chicken skin, they were deemed innocent. Failure meant guilt and often death. This practice led to thousands of deaths annually, with estimates suggesting that by the late 1830s, as much as 20% of the population had perished due to the ordeal. Ranavalona also enforced a policy of isolationism. cutting off trade and diplomatic relations with European powers. She believed that self-sufficiency was essential for maintaining control and independence. To achieve this, she relied heavily on whanampoana, a system of forced labor where citizens were compelled to work on public projects, serve in the military, or provide goods and services to the state. This system placed immense strain on the population, leading to widespread suffering and death. Her military campaigns to expand and consolidate her kingdom further devastated the population. Soldiers were conscripted through whanampoana and sent on brutal expeditions to subdue resistant regions. These campaigns were marked by violence, slavery, and scorched earth tactics. Entire communities were destroyed, and survivors were often enslaved. The combination of warfare, forced labor, and harsh justice reduced Madagascar's population from an estimated 5 million to 2.5 million during her reign. Despite the brutality, Ranavalona maintained a tight grip on power for over 3 decades. She surrounded herself with loyal advisors and used fear to suppress dissent. Her court was a place of intrigue and danger, where accusations of treason or impiety could lead to swift and deadly consequences. Even her own son, Radama II, who favored modernization and engagement with Europe, was kept under close watch. Ranavalona's death in 1861 marked the end of an era of isolation and terror. Her son succeeded her and attempted to reverse many of her policies, reopening Madagascar to foreign influence and attempting to modernize the nation. However, the damage inflicted during Ranavalona's reign had lasting effects on the country's development and its people's psyche. Some historians argue that Ranavalona's actions were driven by a desire to protect her nation's sovereignty and cultural identity in the face of colonial pressures. Others view her reign as a period of tyranny and unnecessary cruelty. Regardless of interpretation, her rule serves as a stark example of how fear and isolation can devastate a society. In the end, Ranavalona I's legacy is one of blood and isolation. Her efforts to preserve Madagascar's independence came at an immense human cost. Her reign stands as a testament to the dangers of absolute power wielded without compassion, and the suffering that can result when a ruler's paranoia dictates policy. In the heart of Africa, there was a kingdom that bled beneath the iron grip of a European king who never set foot on its soil. King Leopold II of Belgium turned the Congo Free State into a private empire, and in doing so unleashed a wave of horror that still haunts the world today. Let me be real with you here. The name Congo Free State was a lie from the very beginning, because there was nothing free about the terror and suffering that unfolded there under the watchful eye of Leopold's men. At first glance, it might seem like a tale of distant lands and ancient empires, but the truth of it is much closer to the bone. Leopold claimed he was bringing civilization to the Congo, that he was lifting the people from darkness into the light of progress. But what he really wanted was rubber and ivory riches that would make him one of the wealthiest men in Europe. And to get it, he turned the Congo into a living nightmare where every tree and river was soaked in blood. Imagine the dense jungles of the Congo, teeming with life, the river winding through a land of green so deep it seemed to swallow the sky. In those shadows, Leopold's agents spread out like a sickness building trading posts and stations that were nothing more than fortresses of cruelty. The soldiers he sent were known as the force publique, and their job was to squeeze every drop of labor from the people, no matter what it cost. Some people swear that the crack of their whips was the first sound of dawn in those days, a rhythm of pain that never ended. You know what's even stranger, the quotas for rubber were impossible, and when the villagers could not meet them, the punishments were swift and brutal. The soldiers would take hostages to ensure compliance, often women and children held as guarantees for a man's labor. And if the rubber did not come, if the baskets did not overflow with the precious sap, the soldiers took payment in blood. It is just odd how something as simple as a tree could become a weapon, how the hunger of a king could turn life itself into a kind of slow death. Anyway, back to the point. The most chilling stories are of the severed hands, proof of a soldier's obedience and a villager's failure. The soldiers of the force publique were given bullets and told to account for every one. So if a shot was fired, a hand was taken to show that no bullet was wasted. Whole villages learned to fear the sight of those hands, the way they were carried back to the stations like grim trophies. Let me be real with you here. It is hard to wrap your head around that kind of horror, but it was real and it was everywhere. Imagine the quiet that must have settled over a village at dusk, the way every man and woman watched the path for the soldiers who might come with guns and whips. The way mothers held their children close their breath, caught in their throats, because they knew that even the smallest mistake could mean a lifetime of grief. Some people swear that the rivers ran red with the blood of those who dared to hope for mercy, but I think the truth is even worse than that, because the rivers also carried away the silence of those who were too afraid to speak. You know what's even stranger? Leopold never set foot in the Congo. He ruled from afar from the comfort of his palaces in Belgium, while the land he claimed as his own was turned into a kingdom of bones. It is just odd how a man can stand so far away and still leave his fingerprints on every tree, every river, every broken body. Let me be real with you here. That kind of power is a poison, and in Leopold's hands it was a poison that spread like wildfire. Anyway, back to the point. The people of the Congo were not passive victims. They fought back in ways both small and grand, refusing to let their spirits be broken even when their bodies were. There were rebellions and uprisings, brave souls who took up spears and machetes and dared to say no. And there were quieter acts of defiance, 2 songs sung in the night, to remember the names of the dead stories, whispered, so that the truth would not be lost to the silence of fear. Imagine the weight of that silence, the way it wrapped around the heart of a kingdom that had been stolen and sold. The way every footstep on the forest floor was a reminder that survival was a kind of resistance. Some people swear that in the darkness of the jungle, the spirits of the dead walked alongside the living, guiding them with the quiet strength of those who refused to be forgotten. Let me be real with you here. I think there is something powerful in that kind of memory, a promise that no matter how deep the wound, the spirit of a people cannot be erased. You know what's even stranger? When the world finally saw the truth of what Leopold had done, it was through the eyes of missionaries and travelers who carried stories of horror back to Europe. And even then, even when the newspapers printed the stories and the photographs of maimed children and broken villages, there were those who refused to believe. It is just odd how the human heart can turn away from pain when the truth is too heavy to bear. But the people of the Congo did not have that luxury. They lived it every day and every night until the king's greed was finally forced to loosen its grip. Anyway, back to the point. When Leopold was finally stripped of his private kingdom, when the Congo was taken from his hands and made a colony of Belgium, the damage was already done. Millions of lives lost, millions more scarred by the years of terror and pain. Let me be real with you here. The Congo Free State was anything but free, and the price of Leopold's ambition was paid in blood that can never be counted. Imagine standing in that land today, the forests still green, the rivers still winding through the heart of Africa, and knowing that every step you take is on ground that remembers. The ghosts of the past do not sleep easily in the Congo. The whispers of the dead still rise with the wind through the trees. Some people swear that you can feel it if you stand still long enough, the weight of all those lives lost, and the promise that they will not be forgotten. So can greed alone explain such a harvest of death? I do not have the answer, and maybe that is the point. Because in the story of Leopold and the Congo, we see the worst of what power can do when it is left unchecked, when one man's hunger for wealth becomes a weapon that tears the world apart. In the end, all that remains is the memory of those who suffered and the quiet promise that their voices will not be lost to the silence. In the heart of ancient Rome, a young emperor ascended the throne, bringing with him a reign that would be remembered for its extravagance, cruelty, and the infamous burning of the city. Nero, who became emperor in the year 54, was only 16 years old when he took power. Initially, his rule showed promise, guided by his mother Agrippina the Younger and the philosopher Seneca. However, as time passed, Nero's desire for absolute control led him down a path of tyranny and excess. Nero's relationship with his mother was complex and ultimately deadly. Agrippina had been instrumental in securing his position as emperor, but her influence became a threat to Nero's authority. In the year 59, after several failed attempts to kill her, including a collapsing boat and poisoned mushrooms, Nero ordered her assassination. This act of matricide shocked Rome and marked the beginning of his descent into despotism. His personal life was equally tumultuous. Nero's first wife, Octavia, was banished and later executed on charges of adultery. His second wife, Poppaea Sabina, met a tragic end when Nero, in a fit of rage, kicked her to death while she was pregnant. These actions reflected his volatile nature and disregard for human life, even among those closest to him. Nero's reign was marked by lavish spending and a focus on the arts, particularly his own performances as a musician and actor. He built the Domus Aurea, or Golden House, an opulent palace complex that showcased his extravagance. This construction came at a great cost to the Roman treasury and further alienated the Senate and the aristocracy. The most notorious event of Nero's rule was the Great Fire of Rome in the year 64. The fire raged for 6 days, destroying much of the city. While some historical accounts suggest Nero was away from Rome when the fire started, rumors spread that he had orchestrated the blaze to clear land for his new palace. To divert suspicion, Nero blamed the Christians, leading to the first major persecution of the sect. Many were tortured and executed in brutal spectacles that served as public entertainment. Nero's obsession with his image and artistic pursuits often took precedence over the welfare of the empire. He participated in theatrical performances and musical competitions, forcing senators and citizens to attend and applaud his talents. His neglect of administrative duties and the burdensome taxes imposed to fund his projects led to widespread dissatisfaction. As discontent grew, rebellions erupted in various provinces. In the year 68, the governor of Hispania, Galba, declared himself emperor, and the Senate turned against Nero. Facing execution, Nero fled Rome and ultimately took his own life, ending his tumultuous 14-year reign. Nero's legacy is one of excess, cruelty, and the dangers of absolute power. His actions left a lasting impact on Rome, serving as a cautionary tale of how unchecked ambition and self-indulgence can lead to a ruler's downfall and the suffering of an entire empire. In the green hills and stone castles of medieval England, there lived a king whose name is still spoken with a shiver of anger and fear. His name was John, and he wore the crown of England in a time of knights and crusaders and the clash of swords on cold steel. Let me be real with you. Here there are some kings who are remembered for their glory and others for their cruelty, and John's name sits squarely in that second group. From the moment he took the throne, he seemed to delight in turning every promise of kingship into a game of greed and spite. At first glance, it might seem like John was simply a man out of his depth, a younger brother who never expected to rule, who stumbled into power when his brother Richard the Lionheart died far from home. But John was more than just an unworthy heir. He was a ruler who saw his kingdom not as a people to protect, but as a treasure chest to plunder. His every move was driven by a kind of hunger that no feast of gold or silver could ever satisfy. Could be nothing, but I think that hunger is what turned John from a king into a parasite feeding on the lifeblood of his people. Imagine the heavy taxes that fell like a storm on the villages and towns, the way farmers and merchants saw their hard work snatched away to fill the king's coffers. John did not just demand tribute, he demanded loyalty and silence, and he took what he wanted with a cold smile that never reached his eyes. Some people swear that he would squeeze a man dry with taxes, then turn around and demand a bribe to let him keep his own land. Let me be real with you here. It was not just greed, it was a kind of cruelty that made every coin ring like a knell of despair. You know what's even stranger? In a time when loyalty was everything, John managed to make enemies of everyone around him. The barons who had once sworn oaths of fealty found themselves driven to rebellion by a king who saw no honor in the promises of the past. It is just odd how the very men who should have been his shield and strength instead became his fiercest critics, because even the strongest oath can break when a king treats his nobles like cattle. Let me be real with you here. John's court was a place of suspicion, and betrayal a nest of vipers who learned from the master himself. Anyway, back to the point. The people of England groaned under the weight of John's taxes and the endless demands of a king who could never be satisfied. Fields lay fallow as farmers fled their lands rather than face the king's sheriffs who came with empty eyes and greedy hands. In the towns, merchants shuttered their shops in fear of the next tax collector's knock, and the poor learned to keep their heads down and their prayers quiet. Some people swear that even the churches were not safe, that John took what he wanted from God's own houses when his coffers ran low. could be nothing, but I think that says more about the soul of a king than any battlefield ever could. Imagine the silent anger that grew in the hearts of the barons and knights, the way they gathered in smoky halls to whisper of rights and freedoms and the promise of a charter that would bind the king's hand at last. Let me be real with you. Here it is, one of those moments in history that still glows bright even through the centuries, because it was not just about taxes or land, it was about the simple idea that a king was not above the law. And so they forced John to the fields of Runnymede, and there in the summer heat of 1215 they pressed his hand to the Magna Carta. You know what's even stranger? Some people say that John never intended to keep the promises he made that day, that even as the ink dried on the parchment, he was already planning how to break the fragile peace he had signed. It is just odd how the same hand that held the quill also held the dagger, waiting to strike the moment his barons turned their backs. Let me be real with you. Here I think John's greatest betrayal was not the taxes or the wars, but the way he twisted every oath into a tool of his own ambition. Anyway, back to the point. The Magna Carta was meant to be a shield for the people of England, a promise that no king could take what he wanted without answer or consequence. But John was a man who saw promises as chains to be broken, and for the rest of his reign, he fought to undo the words he had written. Some people swear that his last years were spent in endless war with his own people, that he would rather see England burn than see his power slip away. Could be nothing, but I think that is the measure of a tyrant, the way he would rather destroy than yield. Imagine the quiet hope that flickered in the hearts of the people as word of the Magna Carta spread the way it carried the promise of justice like a candle against the dark. Let me be real with you. Here it is, a hope that still lives in the hearts of people everywhere, because it speaks to something bigger than kings and crowns, the simple truth that no one is above the law. And even as John raged against it, even as he tried to tear it down, the words of that charter took root in the soul of a nation. You know what's even stranger in the end? It was not a baron's sword or a noble's plot that ended John's reign, but the slow hand of death. He died in the year 1216, worn down by war and betrayal, his body as broken as the kingdom he had tried to bend to his will. It is just odd how a man who thought himself untouchable could be brought so low by the weight of his own cruelty. Let me be real with you here. There is a kind of justice in that, a quiet reminder that even the worst king cannot outrun the truth of his own heart. So when a king becomes a parasite, how do the people find the strength to fight back? I do not have the answer, but I think maybe that is the question that has always burned bright in the darkness of history. Because in the end, it is not just about kings or crowns. It is about the simple power of a people who refuse to be silenced, to stand together and say enough. And in the story of King John and the Magna Carta, we see that truth written in the blood and the hope of a kingdom that learned how to stand up to a tyrant. In the fog of England's cold gray skies, there once lived a queen who believed that the fires of faith were more powerful than the voices of mercy. Her name was Mary I, and history remembers her best as Bloody Mary the Queen, who burned hundreds at the stake in her pursuit of religious purity. Let me be real with you here. When you hear her name, you might think of a drink or a ghost story, but behind that name was a woman whose rule turned England into a kingdom of fear and smoke. At first glance, Mary's story seems almost tragic. She was the daughter of Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon, a princess born to the weight of a crown and the echo of her mother's prayers. But her childhood was a battlefield of faith, torn apart by her father's break with Rome and the creation of the Church of England. Some people say that the wounds of that childhood never healed, that the fires she lit later were just the flames of a young girl's pain grown into a queen's fury. Could be nothing, but I think there is something in that idea, because every spark of her rule seemed to carry the heat of old scars. You know what's even stranger? When Mary took the throne in 1553, she was not just a queen, she was a woman on a mission to turn back the tide of her father's Reformation. She saw herself as God's chosen servant, called to bring England back to the true faith of Rome. And in her eyes, that mission was worth any price, even if it meant turning the streets of her kingdom into rivers of ash and blood. Let me be real with you here. There is a kind of madness that comes from believing you alone hold the key to salvation, and in Mary's court that madness burned as bright as the flames of Smithfield. Anyway, back to the point. The fires of her reign were not just symbols, they were real, and they were everywhere. In the city of London, the air was thick with the smell of burning flesh, the cries of the condemned echoing off stone walls that had seen too much. Hundreds of Protestants, men and women, old and young, were tied to the stake, accused of heresy for daring to believe that faith could look different than the Queen's own. Some people swear that you could hear the crackle of the flames from miles away, that the smoke rose like a black banner above the city. Could be nothing, but I think that kind of horror leaves a mark that no prayer can wash away. Imagine the quiet fear that lived in every sermon and every whispered prayer. The people of England learned to watch their words, to measure their faith with careful precision, because they knew that even the smallest doubt could mean death. The Queen's spies moved through the city like shadows, listening for the tremor of heresy in the softest voice. Let me be real with you. Here it was a world where faith was both armor and noose, a kingdom where every soul was weighed on the scale of the Queen's wrath. You know what's even stranger in the glow of the flames? There were those who found a kind of courage that the Queen could never kill. Men and women who stood in the fire and sang hymns with voices that did not tremble. People who spoke of mercy even as the smoke choked the breath from their lungs. It is just odd how even in the heart of the worst cruelty there can be a kind of grace, a quiet defiance that says no to the darkness. Let me be real with you here. I think that is what Mary could never understand, that faith forced by fear is only a shadow of the truth. Anyway, back to the point. The fires that burned in Mary's name did not bring peace to her kingdom. They brought a silence that was not the peace of faith, but the hush of terror, the pause of a heart that dares not speak. Some people swear that even as the Queen watched the fires from her palace, she knew in her heart that her kingdom was crumbling, that the same flames that devoured heretics were also consuming the soul of England. Could be nothing, but I think that is the cruelest irony of all that. In trying to save her people's souls, she lost their hearts instead. Imagine the whispers in the market, the careful glances in the churches, the way every candle's glow seemed to flicker with a kind of dread. Let me be real with you here. It was not just the bodies of the heretics that burned, it was the trust between ruler and ruled, the quiet bond that makes a kingdom more than just land and stone. And when Mary died in 1558, her crown passed to her sister Elizabeth, and with it the heavy weight of a kingdom left in ashes. You know what's even stranger? Some people say that in her final days Mary was haunted by the ghosts of those she had burned, that the faces of the martyrs rose in the smoke of her dying breath. And maybe that is true, because the past has a way of clinging to the soul like the scent of ash in the air. It is just odd how even the most powerful queen cannot escape the judgment of her own heart. Let me be real with you here. I think that in the end, Mary's greatest punishment was not the whispers of history, but the echo of her own choices. So when faith becomes law, what happens to those who believe differently? I do not have the answer, but I think it is a question that still matters today. Because in the story of Mary I, we see the cost of turning belief into a weapon, the way a crown can become a pyre when power and faith become the same thing. And in the end, all that remains is the memory of the flames and the quiet promise that faith can be something more than fear. Anyway, back to the point. In the end, the fires of Mary's reign could not keep the kingdom in darkness forever. The people of England learned that faith forced by fear is not faith at all, and in the years that followed the voices of the martyrs grew louder, not in screams, but in the songs of a nation that refused to forget. Let me be real with you here. That is the true legacy of Mary's fires, not the terror she tried to build, but the courage she could never kill. In the grand halls of the Ming dynasty, where emperors were expected to embody wisdom and virtue, Zhu Huzhao, known as the Zhongde Emperor, stood apart. Ascending the throne at the tender age of 14 in the year 1505, he inherited a realm shaped by his father, the diligent Hongzhi Emperor. Initially, Zhu Huzhao showed promise, excelling in his studies and displaying a keen intellect. However, as he grew into his role, his reign became marked by a series of eccentricities and indulgences that would leave a lasting impression on Chinese history. From the outset, the young emperor exhibited a penchant for the unconventional. He transformed parts of the Forbidden City into personal playgrounds, constructing elaborate marketplaces where courtiers were compelled to masquerade as merchants, allowing him to role-play as a commoner. This desire to escape the confines of imperial responsibility extended beyond the palace walls. Zhu Huzhao often ventured into the city incognito, frequenting brothels and engaging in activities unbecoming of an emperor. His fascination with the exotic led to the establishment of the Leopard Chamber, a private zoo housing a collection of wild animals, including leopards and tigers. The emperor took great pleasure in training these creatures, often showcasing them in grand displays. This obsession with the untamed mirrored his own unbridled approach to governance. Despite his neglect of state affairs, Zhu Huzhao's reign was not devoid of administrative actions. He appointed capable officials to manage the empire's day-to-day operations, allowing the government to function relatively smoothly in his absence. However, his reliance on eunuchs, particularly Lu Jin, led to significant corruption. Lu Jin amassed considerable power, implementing harsh tax policies and exploiting his position for personal gain. His eventual execution in 1510 did little to curb the influence of eunuchs in the court. The emperor's escapades were not limited to the capital. He embarked on military campaigns, adopting the persona of General Zhu Shou to lead troops against Mongol incursions. While these efforts were more theatrical than strategic, They demonstrated his desire to break free from the ceremonial constraints of his position. In one notable instance, he insisted on releasing and recapturing a rebel prince to experience the thrill of victory firsthand. Zhu Huzhao's reign also saw increased interactions with foreign entities. He welcomed Portuguese envoys and showed an interest in Western innovations. However, these engagements were often superficial, driven more by curiosity than diplomatic intent. Tragically, the emperor's life was cut short in 1521 when he contracted an illness after falling into a lake during a fishing expedition. He died at the age of 29, leaving no heir. His cousin, Zhu Hokong, succeeded him, ushering in a new chapter for the Ming dynasty. Reflecting on Zhu Huzhao's reign, one is struck by the dichotomy between his personal indulgences and the relative stability of his empire. While his actions often bordered on the absurd, the administrative framework established by his predecessors allowed the government to endure. His story serves as a testament to the resilience of institutions and a cautionary tale about the perils of unchecked power and personal excess. In the ancient palaces and cathedrals of Spain, where stone walls whispered the secrets of faith and power, there was once a queen whose piety became an iron fist. Her name was Isabella of Castile, and alongside her husband Ferdinand of Aragon, she reshaped a kingdom in the ruthless image of her beliefs. Let me be real with you here. Isabella's reign marked one of the most harrowing chapters in European history, not because of war or conquest, but because of the terror she unleashed on her own subjects in the name of purity and faith. At first glance, Isabella seemed destined for greatness. Born into the turmoil of Castilian politics, she rose to the throne with courage and determination. She was intelligent, driven, and unshakably devoted to her faith. Her marriage to Ferdinand united the kingdoms of Castile and Aragon, forming the heart of what would become Spain. Yet, beneath the glittering promise of a unified nation lay a darker mission: Isabella's unwavering determination to rid her kingdom of anyone who did not share her vision of religious purity. You know what's even stranger? Isabella truly believed that what she was doing was righteous, that her cruelty was a holy mission. She saw her duty not just as a queen, but as a servant of God, tasked with cleansing her lands of what she perceived as corruption and heresy. It is just odd how the highest intentions can sometimes give birth to the darkest deeds, and Isabella's devotion turned swiftly from protection to persecution. Her vision of a unified, faithful Spain left no room for tolerance, diversity, or mercy. Anyway, back to the point. Isabella and Ferdinand, with chilling resolve, established the infamous Spanish Inquisition in 1478, entrusting it to the ruthless hand of Tomás de Torquemada. Under his guidance, a wave of terror swept across Spain, reaching into every home, every family, every whispered conversation. Suspicion became law, and neighbors turned against neighbors in a chilling dance of accusation and betrayal. Let me be real with you, here there was nowhere to hide. The Inquisition was everywhere, its agents lurking in marketplaces, taverns, and even churches, always listening for signs of hidden heresy. Imagine the fear that must have lived behind closed doors, the hushed voices of families fearing the knock that could come at any hour. People were dragged from their homes under cover of darkness, their fate sealed by the whispered accusations of those who envied them or simply sought safety through betrayal. Thousands were imprisoned, subjected to tortures so horrific that many confessed simply to make the pain stop. The inquisitors had perfected their art, extracting confessions through agony, creating a twisted logic where innocence was impossible to prove, and guilt was always assumed. You know what's even stranger? Many of those targeted were Jews and Muslims who had lived peacefully in Spain for generations, communities whose rich cultures and vibrant traditions had contributed greatly to the kingdom. Isabella's vision of a pure Catholic Spain, however, had no room for diversity. In 1492 she issued the Alhambra Decree, expelling Jews from Spain unless they converted. Families were torn apart, forced to choose between their homeland and their faith. Those who stayed faced constant suspicion, often living double lives, outwardly Catholic but inwardly faithful to their ancestral beliefs. Anyway, back to the point, Isabella's brutal pursuit of religious unity tore apart the very fabric of society. The economy suffered as skilled merchants, scholars, and artisans fled, taking with them knowledge and wealth accumulated over generations. The cultural diversity that had once enriched Spanish life began to fade, replaced by a rigid conformity that stifled innovation and creativity. The Queen's quest for religious purity left deep scars, scars that would haunt Spain for centuries, long after her death. Imagine standing in a crowded plaza, watching as men, women, and even children were paraded before crowds, forced to wear garments of shame, publicly humiliated for their supposed crimes against faith. The fires burned day and night, consuming bodies as easily as they consumed books, ideas, and freedoms. The air grew thick with smoke, the skies darkened by ash. As Isabella's vision became reality, a kingdom purified by pain and fear. Let me be real with you here. The Inquisition was not just an attack on individuals. It was an assault on the human spirit, a chilling example of what happens when power believes itself ordained by God. Isabella's faith, once a source of personal strength, became a weapon wielded against her own subjects, cutting away at the very heart of what it meant to be human and free. Her reign stands as a stark reminder that when religious belief is forced upon others, it loses its grace and becomes tyranny. You know what's even stranger? Isabella's legacy is complicated by her other achievements. She supported Christopher Columbus's voyages, which opened the Americas to European exploration. Her reforms strengthened the Spanish government and laid foundations for future growth. Yet, none of these accomplishments can erase the shadow cast by the Inquisition. It is just odd how one ruler can embody both progress and cruelty, innovation and oppression, leaving a legacy both admired and reviled. Anyway, back to the point. Isabella's life ended in 1504, but the Inquisition continued, echoing her determination to enforce purity long after her death. The terror she began outlived her, shaping Spain's identity for generations. Families remained fractured, trust continued to erode, and fear lingered like smoke long after the fires had gone cold. The country Isabella dreamed of, a united, faithful Spain, was achieved, but at the cost of humanity, compassion, and freedom. Imagine the silence that followed when the fires finally died down, the weight of guilt and sorrow left in their wake. Spain had been purified, yes, but it had also been wounded deeply, its spirit scarred by years of suspicion and brutality. The land itself seemed to mourn, carrying the burden of a queen whose faith became cruelty, whose piety became persecution. Let me be real with you here. Isabella's reign teaches us something important, something we should never forget. Faith forced upon people does not create devotion, it creates fear. Power used to enforce belief is not divine, it is dangerous. Isabella sought to build a kingdom pleasing to God, but in doing so, she created a kingdom of pain. In the end, Isabella's story leaves us with a haunting question. How does a queen's piety become the iron fist of cruelty? The answer, perhaps, lies not in faith itself, but in the human heart's endless capacity to justify cruelty in the name of righteousness. Her story is a warning that power, when driven by fanaticism rather than compassion, will always turn paradise into prison, devotion into dread, and belief into chains. Throughout history, there is a lesson that repeats itself endlessly, whispered in the ruins of fallen kingdoms and echoed in the halls of abandoned palaces. When power corrupts, it is never the rulers alone who pay the price. It is always the people, those who wake each morning with hopes for a better day, and go to bed each night praying for mercy. After exploring the lives of these infamous kings and queens from Caligula to Isabella, it is clear that unchecked power does not merely corrupt, it consumes, leaving a trail of pain and suffering behind that outlasts the tyrants who wielded it. Let me be real with you here. Each of these rulers believed, in their own twisted ways, that their cruelty had purpose. Caligula saw Rome as his personal stage, using terror as entertainment. Ivan the Terrible believed his wrath purified Russia, while Queen Ranavallona's paranoia strangled Madagascar. Leopold's greed reduced the Congo to blood-stained soil. Nero watched Rome burn for his amusement. King John's insatiable hunger drained England's spirit. Mary's fires consumed her own people. Zhu Huzhou's neglect weakened China, and Isabella's faith turned Spain into a prison of fear. In every story, the powerful cloaked their brutality in grand justifications, yet no justification ever mended the shattered lives left behind. You know what's even stranger? Despite all their power, none of these rulers could truly silence the voices of their victims. History itself, stubborn and truthful, speaks clearly even when tyrants have long turned to dust. Their empires have vanished, their crowns rusted, their palaces empty. Yet the stories remain, carried by those who lived through their nightmares and by the generations who followed, determined not to forget. It is odd how, in trying to silence opposition, these rulers ensured they would be remembered forever, not for greatness, but for cruelty. Anyway, back to the point. The question remains, if the price of power is always paid in blood, are we ever truly free from the nightmares these rulers leave behind? Let me be real with you here. The legacy of these rulers is not merely historical. It is a warning. Every generation faces the same choice, whether to surrender their freedom to promises of order and strength, or to hold tightly to their rights and dignity. Every palace built by fear eventually crumbles. Every crown tarnished by cruelty is eventually cast aside. But the cost of such lessons is too often measured in lives lost and dreams shattered. Imagine standing today in places that once echoed with these rulers' commands, feeling the silence of time, seeing the cracks in once proud walls. Rome still bears Caligula's mark in stories whispered through ancient streets. Russia remembers Ivan's fury in tales of families drowned beneath frozen rivers. Madagascar feels the ghostly presence of Ranavalona's paranoia, while the Congo still mourns Leopold's greed. Rome's scars from Nero's fires can still be traced. England remembers John's grasping hands. Mary's flames still flicker in historical memory, and Spain still bears the wounds of Isabella's zealotry. China's memories of Zhu Hao's reckless abandon linger as cautionary tales. Let me be real with you here. The scars these rulers left are reminders that unchecked power always comes at a steep price. You know what's even stranger? Even amid the worst cruelties, there was resistance. People fought back in quiet acts of courage and defiance. They sang songs, told stories, preserved memories, and stood bravely against tyrants. In their quiet rebellion lay the hope that someday the nightmare would end. It is odd, but in every tale of terror we find small lights shining, illuminating the darkness cast by those in power. Those tiny sparks, courage, resistance, and compassion, eventually burned brighter and longer than any tyrant's fires ever could. Anyway, back to the point. History does not just tell stories of cruelty. It teaches lessons about human resilience. It reminds us that even under the harshest rule, the human spirit refuses to be extinguished. It reminds us that power, without compassion, inevitably turns hollow, leaving only empty thrones and broken hearts behind. It shows us clearly that true strength is not found in the ability to harm, but in the courage to heal. Imagine now a future free of tyrants, a future built on lessons learned from these past nightmares. It is possible, but only if we remember clearly the stories we have heard, the pain we have seen, and the lessons these fallen empires teach us. A world without cruelty is not just a dream, it is a choice, made by each generation who refuses to let history repeat itself unchecked. Let me be real with you here. The legacy of these kings and queens is not just horror, it is also hope. Hope that their stories will never be repeated. Hope that their cruelty will be a lesson, and hope that the voices silenced by fear will never again go unheard. In the end, power itself is not the villain, it is what people do with it that matters. And if we remember that, if we refuse to let fear guide our choices, we can create a world where power serves humanity rather than enslaving it. So the final question remains clear. If the price of power is always paid in blood, are we ever truly free from the nightmares these rulers leave behind? The answer is simple but powerful. We can be, but only if we choose freedom over fear, compassion over cruelty, and the strength of unity over the isolation of power. Their reigns of terror ended because people chose to rise above fear and reclaim their dignity. Every tyrant falls because, in the end, cruelty is weaker than courage, fear is weaker than hope, and oppression can never outlast the human spirit's unyielding desire to be free. The stories we have explored are not just history. They are reminders that we have the power to decide what future we will build. We have the power to say, never again, to remember clearly what happens when power is allowed to corrupt, unchecked, and unquestioned. Let me be real with you here. The final victory is not in revenge or even justice, but in ensuring these stories are never repeated, that future generations never know the pain of living under such nightmares. And so, as we close this journey through the lives of history's worst rulers, let us carry with us not just the memories of suffering, but the fierce resolve that their stories should always serve as a lesson. Let us remember clearly the true price of power, and never again allow cruelty to rule. In this final truth lies hope, redemption, and the promise of a better future, built on lessons learned and humanity strengthened by the courage of those who refuse to be broken. So, you think you would have made a good gladiator. Maybe you've watched the movies, imagined stepping into the Colosseum with the sun catching just the right angle on your bronze helmet, sword in hand, crowd at your back. Maybe you see yourself as the lone hero, fearless, lean, brooding. But let's rewind a bit. Let's take away the camera angles, the dramatic music, and the clean, cinematic dust. Because being a gladiator was not a heroic path. It was a punishment, a death sentence, a business. And for the vast majority who ended up in the arena, it was about as glamorous as sleeping in a sewer and being cheered on while someone tried to disembowel you. Let's start with your morning. Assuming you're still alive, that is. You would have woken up not in a private chamber, but in a cramped, dark, reeking cell inside a training school called a ludus. It would be noisy men groaning, coughing, shuffling around on straw mats. You might be chained to a wall, or if you were one of the better performers, maybe just locked behind thick bars. Forget feather pillows. Your bedding was usually a pile of straw that smelled like every other sweaty gladiator who had used it before you. Sanitation was not exactly a Roman priority when it came to prisoners. You did not wake gently. You were kicked, shouted at, or startled by the clatter of a wooden training sword against the iron bars. If you were lucky, breakfast came next. And let's not romanticize that either. Gladiators were fed a highly regulated diet designed not for speed or agility, but for bulk and stamina. They were called horderii, which basically means barley men. You got barley porridge, maybe some beans or lentils, and the occasional sour wine or vinegar water to wash it all down. Meat was rare unless you won a fight or had a wealthy sponsor. The goal was to fatten you up, not for health, but to give your body enough padding to survive cuts. Fatter gladiators bled more impressively, but died a little slower, which was great for the crowd. Then came training, which was long, brutal, and repetitive. From sunup until near sunset, you drilled under the supervision of a lanista part coach, part prison warden. These men did not care about your personal story, your dreams, or whether you used to be a farmer or soldier or just someone who said the wrong thing at the wrong time. Their job was to shape you into a weapon. You were trained to fight with wooden swords weighted heavier than real weapons. You were taught how to fall, how to block, how to die in a way that pleased the crowd. And this training happened outside, under the Roman sun, often in dirt arenas surrounded by high walls and leering spectators who could peek in through slits. The heat was exhausting. The armor scratched. The wooden sword splintered your palms. The lanista carried a whip. He used it. You were expected to improve or suffer, and improvement meant pain. Broken bones, bruised ribs, dislocated shoulders, none of that got you a rest day. If you could stand, you could fight. And fight you did, often against your fellow prisoners, sometimes with dulled weapons, sometimes not. If a man died during training, there might be a murmur of regret, but usually it just meant more food for the rest of you and a reminder to keep your guard up. Outside of training, the life of a gladiator was a strange blend of celebrity and slavery. The Roman public adored you from a distance. You might be the subject of street gossip. Artists painted your likeness on walls. Wealthy women whispered your name during parties. Some of them even paid for secret visits. Gladiators were oddly eroticized, both admired and reviled. People loved the fantasy, the blood, the danger, the sculpted bodies, but they rarely thought of you as fully human. You were property, entertaining property, like a circus tiger or a racehorse. And that meant you could be sold, traded, punished, or killed on a whim. Your lanista had full control over you. He could lease you to a distant arena or deny you food if he felt your performance was lacking. He might even rent you out for banquets where you would serve guests while wearing armor for amusement. Or worse, fight mock battles in someone's backyard while senators laughed and sipped watered wine. But let's talk about the arena, the part everyone imagines. Let's say you made it that far. You're fed, bruised, and still breathing. You're scheduled for a match in the amphitheater. Maybe even the Colosseum if you were well known. That morning, you'd be oiled up, dressed in your armor, assuming you were not in the class of unarmed victims thrown to wild animals for sport and paraded in front of the crowd. The crowd was vast, tens of thousands, some of them drunk, many of them screaming your name or betting on your blood. Women wept. Children pointed. The air was filled with the smell of sweat, dust, animal dung, and anticipation. Trumpets sounded. A sponsor or noble might step forward to make a speech. Then you were shoved into the ring with another man who, like you, had something to lose. And then the fight began. You did not fight to win a war. You fought to survive. Each opponent came with his own style, his own weapons. You might be a secutor, armed with a short sword and shield. Or maybe a retiarius, armed only with a net and trident. Some men had helmets with narrow eye slits. Others wore nothing at all on their heads, making it easier for the crowd to see the blood. The fights were choreographed to a degree, especially in the early empire, but they were still dangerous. People died. Even if you survived, your body told the story scarred, battered, and older than your years. And if you lost, the worst moment came not with a blade, but with a hand. The sponsor might turn to the crowd. The audience would shout and gesture. Thumbs up or down, although in truth, the gestures were more complex. A signal, a call, a whim. And then, if it was decided, the victor would be told to end it. You might be given a moment to kneel. You might be allowed to speak a final word. Or maybe you would be struck from behind, in the neck, quick and brutal. And if you won, you got a moment of applause, maybe a little money, maybe a wreath. You would be dragged out, bloodied, alive, and sent back to the ludus, to sleep on your straw, to eat your barley, and to hope that, the next time, your luck would hold. In the next part, we will look at how the whole gladiator system was born, who built it, why it became so central to Roman life, and what it said about the empire itself. Because behind the noise and blood, the arena was not just entertainment. It was a mirror one that reflected the values of an empire both brilliant and brutal. By the time a Roman gladiator stepped into the arena, He was already part of a system older and stranger than most people realize. Gladiator fights did not begin in the Colosseum. They did not start with emperors or massive crowds. They came from something darker, something smaller, something far more personal. It began with funerals. Back in the early days of the Roman Republic, when the city was still carving itself out between hills and fields, funerals for noblemen sometimes included a special send-off. To honor the dead, 2 slaves would fight to the death at the graveside. Blood would be spilled as an offering to the spirits, a way to give the soul of the deceased a strong escort into the afterlife. That sounds grim, because it was. There were no cheers, no popcorn. It was about ritual, not entertainment. But as with many things in Roman life, a little blood turned into a lot. As time went on, wealthy families began to compete, not just in funerals, but in spectacle. One family hosted 2 fighters. The next one hosted 10. The crowd grew. People began attending these events not to mourn the dead, but to watch the violence, and the Roman elite, never once to pass up an opportunity for power or applause, leaned into it. By the late Republic, public games had become a way to win votes. Politicians sponsored them to build popularity. The bigger the show, the better the chances at election. If your favorite gladiator survived the fight and your sponsor paid for it, you remembered that name come voting day. It became political theater and eventually state policy. By the time the empire rolled in, gladiator games were no longer occasional events. They were part of the Roman calendar. Festivals, religious ceremonies, military victories, they all included public games. Emperors used them to distract, reward, and control the masses. A bored city was a dangerous city. A cheering one was easy to manage. And so the games became bigger, louder, bloodier. And so did the arenas. The Colosseum, the most famous of all, was not just a sports stadium, it was a message. Built by the Flavian emperors, especially Vespasian and Titus, it rose from the ruins of Nero's private palace as a gift to the people. It said, "We took the land from a tyrant, and now we give it back to you." Free shows, bread and entertainment, the people cheered, and the Colosseum roared. But the gladiators? They were never the main attraction at first. The early shows featured wild animals, lions, leopards, elephants, bears. They were brought in from every corner of the empire. Some were trained to perform tricks. Others were used in staged hunts. Sometimes they were set loose on prisoners or criminals, men and women condemned to death for real crimes or simply for being in the wrong class. But the gladiators were different. They were professionals, sort of. Most gladiators were slaves, captured in war or sold by debt-ridden families. Some were criminals sentenced to the arena instead of execution. A few volunteered desperate men looking for fame, money, or a chance to start over. Those who volunteered gave up their freedom, signing contracts that allowed them to be beaten, bled, and possibly killed for public amusement. They trained in ludi, gladiator schools, where they were branded, numbered, and drilled like soldiers. There were many such schools, but the largest and most famous was the Ludus Magnus in Rome, connected by underground tunnels to the Colosseum itself. From the outside, these schools looked like prisons. On the inside, they were brutal factories for producing performers. Gladiators were divided into types, each with specific armor, weapons, and fighting style. The Murmillo fought with a heavy shield and short sword. The Retiarius fought with a net and trident. The secutor was designed to chase. The threx used a curved blade and small shield. Each type had its own rhythm, its own purpose. They were paired not at random, but for contrast: speed versus strength, armor versus agility. It was not just fighting, it was choreography, a deadly ballet. And each fight was about more than just blood. It was about image. The Roman audience was not passive. They watched closely. They booed. They cheered. They placed bets. They studied the style of each fighter the way modern fans study sports stats. They loved drama. A man who fought bravely and died well could be remembered forever. A man who begged, hesitated, or ran, he was booed, jeered, sometimes even killed after surrender just for disappointing the crowd. This obsession with violence was not seen as strange by the Romans. To them, it was part of life. Strength was celebrated. Weakness was punished. Blood was a symbol of honor. Death was a stage. And the emperor, sitting high above the crowd, was both sponsor and judge. Sometimes he would give mercy. More often, he would let the crowd decide. And the crowd, once stirred, rarely asked for kindness. It is easy to think of these games as savage, as primitive. But the truth is, they were structured, rehearsed, even regulated. There were referees, rules, and medics. Injured fighters were patched up between shows. Some were given rest periods. Some earned prize money. The best fighters became celebrities, with fans, graffiti, and sponsors. They could even be granted freedom, a wooden sword called a rudis, marking them as a man who had earned his release. But very few lived that long. Most died in the arena. If not in their first year, then soon after. Some died from wounds, some from infection, some from sheer exhaustion. They were replaceable. There was always another man waiting in the wings, another hungry volunteer, another prisoner promised a chance. In the next part, we will step into the ludus itself, the training ground where gladiators lived, bled, and waited. We will see how they ate, how they slept, how they trained, and how they dealt with the long, anxious days between battles. Because in many ways, it was not the arena that broke them. It was everything that led up to it. If the Roman arena was the grand stage, the ludus was the cage that prepared you for it. This was not a school in the way most of us imagine schools. There were no books, no lectures, no time off for good behavior. The ludus was a training ground built like a prison. Tall walls, locked gates, guards who watched you more like property than people. And if you had dreams of escape, forget it. The Roman Empire had a way of finding what it wanted, and if it lost you, it would replace you faster than you could untie your sandals. Most gladiators lived inside the ludus full time. There were no quick strolls around the city or evenings off to visit friends. You lived where you trained. You slept in dormitory-style cells, usually shared with another fighter. The air was hot and stale, especially during the summer. There were no windows, just slits in the walls that let in dry air and distant echoes of Rome's streets. Your bed, if you can call it that, was a wooden platform with straw on top. If the straw was moldy or full of lice, you picked through it and dealt with it. Blankets were coarse. Pillows were rare. You did not sleep to dream, you slept to survive. Because when the sun came up, you would be run ragged until it went down again. A typical day began early. Before the city outside had even stirred, the lanista, the man who owned and trained you, made his rounds. He would inspect the men, check injuries, sometimes bark out instructions. He was not your coach in the modern sense. He was your master. He had the power to punish you, lease you, or sell you. He could deny you food. He could arrange a fight. And if he thought you were not trying hard enough, he could replace you with someone more desperate. Training began after a simple breakfast, usually a bowl of barley porridge or boiled beans. You might get a crust of bread, sometimes a small fig if supplies were good. Meat was rare. Fats and oils were more common not for flavor, but for building bulk. A fatter gladiator survived longer. It was not about health or nutrition. It was about keeping you alive just long enough to make money off your fights. The training yard was brutal. Open air, packed dirt, and the smell of sweat, blood, and metal. You trained with rudas wooden swords heavier than real ones, meant to build strength and discipline. You were taught to lunge, parry, strike, and fall. Repetition ruled the day. You did the same drills hundreds of times until they became second nature. You were trained to protect your exposed areas, to read your opponent's eyes, and to always fight with performance in mind. Because the arena was not just a battle, it was a show. There were sparring matches, too, often more violent than necessary. These were real men with real injuries, practicing with tools that could still break bones. There were referees, but little sympathy. You might be paired with a fresh recruit one day and a seasoned killer the next. And if you lost a tooth or broke a finger, you wrapped it and kept going. Armor and weapons were fitted to your gladiator class. Some fighters wore heavy helmets with tiny eye holes that reduced vision to a narrow tunnel. Others had nothing to protect the head at all. Some classes used round shields and curved swords, others nets and tridents. You trained in your gear constantly. Even if it cut, pinched, or weighed you down, you wore it until it became a second skin. And training did not end when the body gave out. Mental drills followed. The lanista might make you recite tactics, fight sequences, or even rehearse death scenes. Yes, that was part of the job too. Knowing how to die well dramatically, honorably, with your eyes open and your chest out could win the crowd. A well-timed collapse or a dramatic final breath might convince a sponsor to spare you. Or, at the very least, it made for good theater. Some gladiators had moments of relief between training sessions. They might be allowed to rest, bathe, or receive visitors. Sometimes women came, wealthy Roman women known for their fascination with gladiators. These were not romantic affairs. Gladiators were viewed as thrilling, exotic, dangerous. The attraction was one-sided. The women were free. The men were chained. And not everyone had visitors. Most were forgotten. Prisoners from distant lands, criminals, or men too poor to have family in Rome. The only real company was each other. Fighters formed bonds. They shared advice, jokes, and scraps of food. They wrapped each other's wounds and sometimes whispered about escape, even if they knew it would never happen. Punishment was common. If you disobeyed, you might be beaten, starved, or placed in solitary confinement. There were darker rumors, too, of men forced to fight to the death as punishment, or thrown to animals during practice. The lanista had near total control. Gladiators were assets. When they stopped performing, they were discarded. But the ludus was not only a place of brutality, it was also strangely efficient. Medical care, for instance, was better than for most of Rome's poor. Not because the trainers were kind, but because a healthy gladiator was more profitable than a sick one. Broken bones were set, infections were treated, cuts were stitched, You were repaired but never coddled. At night, the ludus grew quiet. The torchlight flickered across stone walls. The moans of injured men echoed through corridors. Some prayed. Others wept quietly. You never knew if tomorrow's training would lead to an arena, and you never knew if the arena meant death. You slept with one ear open and your hand near your side. Trust was rare. And even in the stillness, you felt the weight of eyes. The city never stopped watching. You were a spectacle in waiting, a showpiece in training. Even your pain had an audience. In the next part, we will follow a gladiator's journey into the arena from the rituals of preparation to the moment the gates open and the crowd roars. We will walk through every beat of the fight itself, not as a movie moment, but as a raw, tense, minute-by-minute test of survival in the most unforgiving theater of the Roman world. There is a certain kind of silence that comes before a fight, not the peaceful kind, not the quiet of a calm morning. This silence is heavy. It presses on your chest. It sits behind your ears. For a gladiator, the day of a fight began with that silence and a feeling in the stomach that mixed fear, hunger, and resignation into a single nauseating lump. No one spoke much when the sun first touched the stone walls of the ludus. Some men stared at the ceiling, blinking slowly. Others prayed to gods they barely believed in. A few paced. One or two might hum quietly under their breath, not to be brave, but to keep the thoughts from slipping into panic. The lanista walked the halls without speaking, his eyes scanning faces. He already knew who would fight. You were told the day before. That way, you had all night to think about it. You rose from your straw-covered bed slowly, carefully. Everything felt heavier. Your arms, your armor, your breath. Breakfast was given, though few ate it. Maybe barley bread. Maybe a few figs. Some wine diluted with water. You were told to eat for strength, but who could eat when their hands were shaking? Then came the preparations. A medic inspected you briefly. Your wounds had to be closed, bruises wrapped. They could not risk sending a man into the arena who would collapse too soon. A good fight required drama, balance, suspense. Next, the attendants brought your armor. Each piece was familiar but always uncomfortable. The leather straps bit into your skin. The helmet, heavy and hot, turned the world into a tunnel. Your weapon was checked, balanced, handed over like a final gift. And then the oil. Your chest, shoulders, and arms were rubbed with oil to make your muscles shine under the sun. It made you easier to see from the stands. You were not a soldier, you were a spectacle. A living statue shaped by pain, hunger, and fear. If you had a nickname or a reputation, it might be whispered among the spectators already filing into the amphitheater. If you were a newcomer, your name might be called once, then forgotten. Once dressed, you were led out with the others, a line of men shaped by weeks, months, sometimes years of blood-soaked routine. The tunnel to the arena was cool, narrow, lined with flickering torches. It smelled of sweat, dust, and old iron. You could hear the noise before you saw the sky. The murmur of a crowd, the stomp of feet, the occasional shrill bark of a vendor shouting for attention. And then, the light. The gates opened, and the sun hit your face like a slap. The arena spread out before you like a giant open wound, massive, circular, framed by rows and rows of people. The Colosseum could hold more than 50,000. Other amphitheaters were smaller, but the feeling was always the same. You were in the middle of something ancient, hungry, loud. It felt like being dropped into the mouth of a god. Some in the crowd were already standing, waving, cheering. Others drank wine, passed bets, or shouted insults. Children leaned forward, pointing. Women waved scarves. You were a stranger, and yet you were theirs. For the next 10 minutes, 10 seconds, 10 heartbeats, however long it took, they would watch everything. A herald stepped out and called names. The crowd responded. Sponsors raised their hands. Trumpets sounded. The other man was across from you now, dressed in his own armor. His helmet hid his face, but you could see how he shifted his weight. Nervous, tired, focused, just like you. Then came the signal. There was no long speech, no dramatic moment of music, just a hand gesture, a shout, and then the fight began. At first, you circled. You kept your guard up. You listened. You waited. The crowd murmured, eager for contact. Your breathing became loud inside your helmet. Your sword felt heavier than it had during training. Every step stirred dust. Every feint drew a reaction from the crowd. Then the first clash. It was loud, brutal, the kind of sound that made your bones vibrate. Steel on steel, a grunt, a stumble, a slip. You adjusted. You recovered. You struck again. There was no elegance, no dance. It was not like the movies. It was fast, frantic, ugly. Real fights were full of missed swings, shallow cuts, and wild scrambles for footing. If a man fell, he rolled. If a helmet came off, the crowd gasped. If blood hit the sand, the cheers rose. You learned not to focus on the crowd. If you listened too closely, you might hear someone calling for your death, a child laughing at your pain, a man shouting a bet on your opponent. You tuned it out. You fought for survival. The referee watched closely. He had a staff. He would separate you if things got sloppy, but he did not stop the fight unless one of you was clearly finished. A man on the ground disarmed, bleeding. A man kneeling, arms out, waiting. If you were lucky, it was not you. If it was, then you waited for the verdict. The crowd watched the sponsor, a merchant, a general, sometimes the emperor himself. He would decide. If your fight had been brave and entertaining, you might be spared. If you had hesitated, turned your back, or lost too quickly, death was more likely. The crowd gave its signal, a turn of the thumb, sometimes up, sometimes down, sometimes sideways. Historians still debate exactly what meant what, but in the moment you knew, you felt it. If you were spared, you were dragged out by attendants and taken to the medics. If not, your opponent would finish the job quickly. A sword to the neck, a blow behind the ear. The arena could not afford messy deaths. It spoiled the mood. Back in the ludus, the survivors were silent. Some were treated for wounds. Others were congratulated. A few wept quietly when no one was watching. You had lived. For now. In the next part, we will explore the social world surrounding the arena, the fans, the gamblers, the sponsors, the lovers, and the politics that made gladiators into pawns of power and obsession. Because for every man who bled in the sand, there were dozens more pulling strings from the stands. The moment a gladiator stepped into the arena, his life no longer belonged to him. But what many people forget is that his life also never really belonged to just his master or trainer. It belonged to Rome, or rather, to the people of Rome. tens of thousands of them, packed into the stands with wine on their breath, hunger in their eyes, and bets in their hands. Because as brutal as the arena was, it wasn't a private execution. It was a show, and shows need an audience. That audience came from every layer of Roman society. The poor sat in the highest tiers of the Colosseum, squinting down from wooden benches in the hot sun. They brought bread, pickled fish, cheap wine, and wild enthusiasm. The closer you got to the arena floor, the wealthier the crowd became: senators, merchants, generals, priests. Some wore togas trimmed with purple. Others carried scrolls and betting slips, gossiping about which fighters had the best odds. Women were there too, and they were not quiet about it. Gladiators were objects of obsession, especially for wealthy Roman women. These fighters were everything. Their husbands were not dangerous, muscular, exotic, and unattached. They appeared in murals, graffiti, and dreams. Some women paid handsomely for a night with a famous gladiator, and while the men of Rome scoffed at this, they often did the same with dancers and slaves. Hypocrisy was cheap. Gladiators were not. Then there were the gamblers. They came early and sat near the action. These were men who knew the names, stats, and styles of every fighter. They could recite how many victories a man had, who trained him, what injuries he had suffered. They tracked wins, injuries, and rumors. They shouted odds across the arena like traders in a market. Fights were risky, but so were the payouts. One clean strike could make or ruin a man's fortune in seconds. Even graffiti reflected this. Carvings on city walls named popular gladiators and showed drawings of their gear. Some walls had tallies of wins. Others showed symbols for crowd favorites or mocked those who lost badly. One piece of graffiti found in Pompeii names a gladiator as the delight of all the girls. Another calls a man savior of the arena, with hearts scratched beside his name. These were not private jokes. They were public announcements. Gladiators, for a brief moment, were celebrities. But like all celebrity in ancient Rome, it came with strings thick, choking ones tied to power and politics. Every major gladiator game required a sponsor. Sometimes it was a senator, other times a general, and often it was the emperor himself. These men were not just paying for entertainment. They were buying favor. Gladiator games were political tools. A well-funded show could gain votes, calm a restless population, or distract the masses from bad news. Bread and circuses, as the poet put it, feed the people and give them something to watch, and they will not ask too many questions. Sponsors wanted drama. They wanted blood. They wanted the crowd to chant their names. If a show was dull, they were mocked. If it was thrilling, they were praised as generous and powerful. Some sponsors ordered rare animals to be shipped from Africa or Asia. Others arranged for elaborate battles with themes recreations of famous wars, naval fights flooded into the arena, or mock sieges with towers and flaming arrows. And then there were the executions. Before the main matches began, the arena often hosted public punishments. Criminals, traitors, and slaves condemned to death were marched into the sand. Some were forced to fight wild animals with no weapons. Others were tied to stakes and left to be mauled. These scenes were not just about justice. They were about reminding everyone in the stands who held power. The message was clear: disobey, and this could be you. Children watched this. They sat beside their parents, learning early what Rome valued: strength, obedience, spectacle. They learned to cheer when blood spilled, to laugh when a condemned man begged for mercy. It was all part of the culture. Not because Romans were heartless, but because the system had taught them that suffering, when packaged with fanfare, was something to enjoy. And while all this happened, the gladiators waited below. In the hypogeum, the underground complex beneath the Colosseum, men paced in the shadows. They heard the roar of the crowd, the stamp of feet, the cries of animals. They could not see the fights above, but they felt them. The noise traveled through the stone like thunder. Sometimes they peeked through trapdoors, catching glimpses of flashing swords or falling bodies. They were not alone. The underground held animals in cages, stage crews ready to lift platforms, and slaves who ran messages back and forth. The air was damp and hot. The smell was thick with straw, sweat, and blood. This was not a sacred waiting room. It was a dungeon beneath a party. And yet, for all its darkness, the system worked. The city cheered, the games continued, and the names of favored gladiators were remembered briefly. A man might win a few fights and be given gifts, coins, or even a fan following. If he was lucky and skilled, he might be awarded a wooden sword, the rudis, and his freedom. Some chose to leave. Others stayed, drawn to the strange, addictive pull of the arena. Where else could a slave become famous? Where else could a nobody hear a stadium shout his name? Of course, that fame was fickle. One bad fight, one unlucky slip, one sponsor in a foul mood, and it was over. You were just another body dragged from the sand and dumped in a common grave. In the next part, we will follow the journey of a gladiator who survived long enough to win his freedom. What did freedom mean after years in the arena? Could you return to normal life? And how did the public treat a man who had been both killer and hero, slave and star? Because surviving the fight was one thing. Surviving what came after was something else entirely. There were no guarantees in the arena. Most men died before they ever got close to fame, let alone freedom. But sometimes, after years of surviving fights, pleasing the crowd, and bleeding just enough to be exciting, but not enough to die, a gladiator was granted a reward, a wooden sword. It did not cut, it did not kill, but it meant everything. It was called the rudis, and it marked a man as liberatus free. But freedom was not as clean as the gesture that granted it. The ceremony itself could be grand or simple. In the Colosseum, the emperor or sponsor would present the rudis to the victorious gladiator in front of thousands of roaring spectators. The crowd often chanted his name. The fighter, sometimes weeping, would take the wooden sword and raise it high. It was his signal to the world. He had paid his dues. He had survived the worst Rome had to offer. He could now walk away. Except many didn't. Some men chose to stay in the arena even after winning freedom. They became Octorati volunteer gladiators who continued fighting for money and prestige. To outsiders, this looked insane. Why would someone choose to go back into the sand after finally stepping out of it? But the truth was complicated. A freed gladiator had no land, no status, and few connections. He had spent years being fed, clothed, and housed. Now he had none of that. Even those who did leave often found life outside the ludus difficult. Imagine living as a weapon for years, only to be told to become a civilian. You wake up with scars covering your arms, joints stiff from injuries. You flinch when someone raises their hand too fast. You are recognized in the street, not as a man, but as a former killer. Some people cheer, others look away. Some mutter about your past. Freedom, in theory, gave you rights. You could marry, own property, work. But the social weight of being an ex-gladiator never fully lifted. You were known, yes, but not always respected. You might be feared, you might be admired from a distance, but very few would welcome you into polite Roman society. You were not born into a noble house. You were not educated. You were, to them, still a fighter, still a slave in the mind, even if not on paper. A few tried to open businesses. Some sold weapons, trained other fighters, or became bodyguards. A rare few taught in ludi, helping the next generation of gladiators survive what they had barely escaped. Others fell into hard times. No skills, no family, and no structure often led to poverty, crime, or death on the streets. There were exceptions. Some gladiators became wealthy if they had fought in many games and won valuable prizes. They bought homes, hired servants, even married Roman women. But these cases were rare. Fame, even in Rome, was not always the same as success, and while the crowd loved a champion, they quickly moved on when the next favorite rose. Some former gladiators tried to hide their past. They changed cities, took on new names. They grew out their hair or stopped wearing the marks of their trade. But the body never forgot. The way they walked, the shape of their muscles, the scars on their arms, all betrayed them. People noticed. Whispers followed. And it was not uncommon for someone to ask, "Weren't you the one who fought the Retiarius at the Spring Games 3 years ago? And you, weren't you the one who took down that Gaul with the hammer?" Even romance was complicated. Gladiators, while often adored by women during their time in the arena, were not ideal marriage material. They were considered dangerous, unpredictable. Some women liked that. Others tolerated it for status. But many were discouraged or forbidden from marrying a former fighter. Families did not want the blood of slaves mixing into their lines, even if the man had earned his freedom with grit and steel. And then there were the dreams. Former gladiators often suffered from nightmares, though they would not have called them that. In a world without the language of trauma or psychology, these men simply called it restlessness. They drank to forget. Some returned to the ludus not to fight, but to sleep near familiar walls. The clanging of swords, the bark of a lanista, the smell of dust, these things, though once feared, became strangely comforting. They were reminders of identity, of routine, of a time when life, though cruel, was clear. Others struggled with guilt. It's easy to imagine a gladiator as a mindless killer, but many carried the weight of what they had done. They had taken lives sometimes out of necessity, other times for show. They had seen men beg, bleed, and die beneath their blade. They had heard the cheers as another man's breath left his lungs. Even if you won, you lost something each time. The soul bruises just as easily as the flesh. So what did freedom really mean? It meant choices, certainly, but also isolation. It meant waking up and not knowing what came next, a feeling unfamiliar to someone who had every hour of every day planned for him. It meant walking through markets where no one shouted your name anymore. It meant sitting alone at night with a wooden sword on your table and nothing to fight but memories. And yet, some found peace. A few former gladiators built new lives. They taught, married, raised children who never saw the inside of an arena. They told stories around fires, not always the real versions, but ones with cleaner endings. Some became local legends. Others faded into quiet anonymity. And perhaps that, after all the noise, was what they wanted most. In the next part, we will turn our eyes to the women of the Roman world, not just the wives and noble daughters, but the slaves, the servants, and the female gladiators who stepped into the sand despite everything stacked against them. Because while the arena was mostly a man's world, it was never only a man's story. The Roman arena, at first glance, was a man's world. The fighters were almost always male. The trainers, the referees, the emperors, who gave the thumbs all men. But to think that women were not present in the story of the gladiator is to miss half the picture. They were there every step of the way, watching, whispering, paying, and sometimes stepping into the arena themselves. Let us begin with the spectators. Roman women were regular attendees at the games. Not just the poor or the bored, but noble women in silk robes, dripping in jewelry, seated just behind the magistrates and senators. They brought their children. They came with friends. They clapped, they laughed, they swooned. Gladiators, with their oiled muscles and blood-slicked swords, were more than just fighters. They were a fantasy. In a world where most women had little public power, watching a gladiator become both adored and feared was its own kind of thrill. Graffiti scratched into the walls of Pompeii confirms what the official records avoided. Women had favorites. They carved their names beside hearts. One bit of ancient graffiti reads, "Celadus the Thracian is the delight of the girls." Another simply says, "Crescens, the net fighter, makes the girls sigh." These were not mere observations. They were declarations. Gladiators were Rome's first sex symbols, and women were fully aware of it. The elite found this concerning. Male writers of the time wrung their hands in their scrolls, warning that noble women were becoming too familiar with the fighters. Stories circulated of senators' wives sneaking into ludi at night, slipping past guards with coins and favors, just to be near the men who bled for applause. Some tales were probably exaggerated, passed around by gossip-hungry aristocrats, but others had weight. There are documented cases of women being caught with gladiators, even marrying them, often against their families' wishes. These relationships, even if rare, spoke to something deeper. Gladiators represented raw power, not political or intellectual power, but the kind earned through pain, muscle, and survival. In a society where marriage was often transactional and women were expected to remain demure, the dangerous, untamed gladiator held an allure that went beyond the physical. It was rebellion, a brush with the forbidden. But women were not only spectators or lovers. In some cases, they were fighters too. Yes, female gladiators existed. The Romans called them gladiatrices. Rare, but real. These women were not trained in large numbers, nor were they allowed to fight in Rome's biggest amphitheaters. But they did fight, often in provincial cities or during smaller shows, meant to amuse and shock the crowd. They were curiosities, spectacles meant to blur the lines of gender and tradition. The philosopher Seneca, always ready to grumble about society's decline, mocked the idea of women fighting in the arena. To him, and many like him, it was a sign that Rome had become too decadent. That women, once modest and noble, were now donning helmets and taking up swords. But despite the criticism, the fights happened. The records survive. A marble relief found in Turkey shows two female fighters, named Amazon and Achillea, squaring off with swords and shields. Both survived the fight and were granted their freedom. These women were often slaves or lower-class volunteers. They were trained in small ludi, sometimes even alongside men. Their gear was similar, though usually lighter. They wore short tunics or sometimes fought bare-chested, depending on the event and the sponsor's taste for spectacle. Their fights were not treated with the same seriousness as male bouts, but they drew crowds. The novelty was too tempting, the risk too thrilling. Life for a female gladiator was every bit as harsh as it was for men. The training, the diet, the injuries, all the same. The judgment, though, was double. They were considered vulgar by some, dangerous by others, and fascinating by nearly everyone. Some audiences cheered with delight. Others watched in horror. Either way, the effect was the same. People talked, sponsors paid, the games went on. Beyond the arena, women's involvement with gladiators took quieter forms. Wives of sponsors might help arrange events. Female servants in the ludus brought food, water, and sometimes bandages. Courtesans mingled with the fighters during off hours, trading stories and services. Even priestesses attended some games, offering prayers for the souls of those about to die. And then there were the mothers, forgotten by most, but always present in the story. Some women watched their sons go into the arena prisoners of war, condemned criminals, or desperate boys who volunteered for a chance at food and coin. These mothers did not sit in noble seats or carve hearts into marble. They stood in the back, silent, watching, hoping, dreading. When the crowd cheered, they flinched. When the gate opened, they held their breath. For them, the arena was not a spectacle. It was a nightmare dressed in sunlight. Women were everywhere in the gladiators' world, watching from balconies, praying in temples, whispering through curtains, clapping from the stands. Occasionally, stepping into the dust with a sword of their own. They were not just background characters in the blood-soaked theater of Rome. They were part of the script. In the next part, we will walk through the end of the arena itself. What happened when Rome began to change? When emperors turned their backs on blood sport and the games lost their grip on the people? We will trace the slow death of the gladiator system and what it left behind in memory, in myth, and in the bones buried beneath the sand. Because nothing in Rome, not even violence, could last forever. For centuries, the roar of the crowd was a constant in the Roman world. From the early Republic to the Golden Age of the Empire, gladiator games were the rhythm of the people. They marked victories, honored the gods, soothed unrest, and filled the silence of Rome with blood and noise. But no empire lasts forever, and neither did its taste for spectacle. The decline of the gladiatorial games did not happen all at once. It was not a single decree, nor a sudden shift. It was slower than that of fading, a loss of appetite, a quiet turning of the head. The change began not in the sand of the arena, but in the shadows of thought. By the 2nd and 3rd centuries, Rome was changing. The empire had grown too large, too unstable, and too expensive. Civil wars chipped away at its strength. Emperors rose and fell with dizzying speed. The frontiers were harder to hold, the economy strained under the weight of its own ambition. And in the cities, people began to ask new questions about life, death, and the soul. Philosophy was one of the first cracks in the wall. Stoics, who had always been uneasy with the idea of people killing one another for applause, spoke more boldly against the games. Seneca, long before, had written that watching men die numbed the spirit. He compared it to murder under the pretense of entertainment. Others echoed him. These were not fringe voices anymore. They were teachers, scholars, and respected men in the halls of power. Then came the Christians. At first, they were outsiders, persecuted, ridiculed, even executed in the same arenas where gladiators fought. But their influence grew. Slowly, steadily, they gained followers. Their view of the body, of violence, and of the soul was different from the Roman tradition. They saw the games not as a celebration of courage, but as a sin against creation. Life was sacred. Blood should not be shed for pleasure. As Christianity moved from the fringes of society into the heart of the empire, the mood began to shift. One emperor after another tried to walk the line. Some supported the games openly, others reduced them. A few issued orders limiting how often they could take place, but the people still came. The old appetite died hard. The games were familiar, comfortable, part of the Roman identity. To end them outright was to admit something had changed, and Romans rarely admitted that without a fight. Still, the world kept turning. The costs grew steeper. Training a gladiator took time, money, and resources. Feeding the schools, building the arenas, and keeping a constant supply of fighters was a burden. The great empire that had once flowed with gold now had to choose between spectacle and survival. When plagues came, when crops failed, when enemies circled the borders, the games began to seem less essential. And then there was the Emperor Honorius. In the early 5th century, with Rome under pressure and Christian influence stronger than ever, he issued a decree that effectively banned gladiatorial combat. The Colosseum, once the beating heart of Roman entertainment, began to fall silent. There were protests, grumbling. Some private matches continued in secret or in the provinces, where the reach of imperial law was weaker. But the age of the arena had ended. Not with a sword in the sand, but with a whisper. What followed was not exactly peace. Rome would still see violence, invasions, collapse, rebirth in different forms. But the image of the gladiator, once so central to Roman life, began to slip into memory. The ludi were closed. The amphitheaters turned to ruins or were repurposed. Stones were carried away to build churches and fortresses. Grass grew where blood once pooled. The sands were quiet. And yet, the gladiator did not vanish completely. He lived on in stories, in faded mosaics and scratched graffiti, in statues whose names were forgotten but whose poses still spoke of combat. Children in the streets still played at being murmillos and retiari, swinging sticks and yelling to invisible crowds. The legend of the arena was too big to bury completely. As centuries passed, new eyes looked on the ruins with wonder. Medieval writers misunderstood them. Renaissance scholars romanticized them. And in time, artists, poets, and eventually filmmakers turned the gladiator into something else, a symbol. No longer a slave, no longer a pawn of the empire, but a hero, a rebel. A lone figure standing against impossible odds. Of course, the truth was more complicated. Gladiators were not all heroes. They were not all brave. Many were terrified. Many fought only because they had no choice. But myth is rarely interested in accuracy. What mattered was the feeling, the sweat, the roar, the defiance. It struck a chord. It still does. Even today, we speak of people fighting like gladiators. We imagine them as icons of strength, of endurance, of honor. But rarely do we think about what it actually felt like to wake up in a cold cell, to eat barley until you were sick of it, to strap on heavy armor knowing the next man you faced might be the last one you saw. That part gets lost in translation. In the next part, we will explore what archaeology has uncovered: the bones beneath the sand, the weapons rusted in the dirt, the tablets, the graffiti, the remains of schools and arenas that tell the quiet truths the myths forget. Because the gladiators did not leave behind books, they left behind scars in stone and bone. And sometimes that says more than any scroll ever could. Long after the crowd stopped cheering and the last swords clattered to the dust, the silence of the arena remained. The Colosseum still stands, of course, weathered by time and earthquakes, a hollow echo of what it once was. But beneath the arches, beneath the cities, and deep in the soil of forgotten amphitheaters, pieces of the gladiators still wait. Their stories, once drowned in cheers and blood, now speak through dirt, bone, and broken stone. The first and most immediate discovery that tells us about these men comes from their remains. In places like Ephesus, York, and Pompeii, archaeologists have uncovered burial sites believed to belong to gladiators. These are not the grand tombs of senators or generals. They are simple, sometimes communal, but they hold more truth than 1,000 inscriptions. Their bones speak plainly. You can see the years of trauma, fractured ribs, healed sword cuts, smashed knuckles, and worn-down joints. Some skulls show repeated blunt force injuries, likely from training accidents or repeated combat. In one case, a skeleton showed a clean hole through the side of the skull, likely made by a trident. Others had leg bones thickened from the constant pressure of heavy armor. But what stands out most is the consistency. These men were physically strong, well-fed, and had medical care that was better than the average Roman citizen. Their diets, confirmed by isotopic analysis, included high levels of calcium and carbohydrates, barley, beans, and mineral supplements made from plant ash. This lines up with ancient writings that called gladiators barley men. They were not lean and agile like modern athletes. They were thick, muscular, padded with mass that made wounds less deadly. Some of the most famous archaeological finds have come from Pompeii. When Mount Vesuvius erupted in the year 79, it froze the city in time. Among the bodies preserved in ash were gladiators and their families. In one building, believed to be a ludus, researchers found armor, weapons, training tools, and even the remains of a man who had likely tried to escape during the eruption, chained in place. One of the most curious items discovered was a piece of graffiti etched into a wall near a training ground. It showed two gladiators mid-fight, with names scribbled beside them. One had a crown drawn above his head, a mark of victory. The other had a scratch through his name. Just like that, in a few lines of charcoal, someone captured the tension of a real match. Not from a historian's point of view, but from the audience's. Graffiti, in fact, is one of the richest sources we have for understanding how gladiators were seen by the people. In cities across the empire, you can still find names carved into plaster, sometimes with hearts, other times with curses. People wrote messages like Spiculus, the darling of Rome, or Verus, winner of 15 matches. It was as if fans were keeping score, cheering their favorites, and adding a very human layer to a very brutal world. In some amphitheaters, inscriptions and carvings list the names of fighters, the dates of matches, and even the odds. One stone tablet records a match between two gladiators and notes that both were granted mercy, something that would have been rare enough to deserve commemoration. These little clues scattered across ruins and museum drawers stitched together a clearer picture of what life was actually like. Even the weapons tell a story. Gladiator gear, found in places like Pompeii and Carnuntum, reveals a great deal about their routines and expectations. The helmets were often heavy, with narrow eye slits, designed to limit vision and increase drama. Shoulder guards, greaves, and chest plates were custom-made for specific classes of fighters. Some had detailed engravings, not just for intimidation, but for showmanship. These were not practical weapons meant for efficient battle. They were tools of theater, as much for the audience as the opponent. In the city of Carnuntum, in modern-day Austria, archaeologists discovered a remarkably preserved ludus. Using ground-penetrating radar, they mapped out an entire gladiator school training halls, sleeping quarters, and even a bathhouse. It was the size of a small fortress. There were traces of where men had practiced, where they had slept, and even a small graveyard nearby. It painted a picture not of mindless savagery, but of routine, order, and discipline. There were other surprises, too. In the bathhouse, walls were covered with carvings, not just names, but drawings of horses, animals, and people. It was a reminder that even men trained to kill still carved little symbols to pass the time. They waited, they scratched, they left pieces of themselves behind. And then there were the cemeteries. Some gladiators were buried with honors. Not many, but a few. One tombstone from Turkey honors a gladiator named Diodorus, who was killed unfairly during a match. The stone does not just list his victories. It accuses the referee of making a bad call. Even in death, Diodorus wanted justice. His voice still echoes from the stone, angry and proud. These finds, while scattered, give us something more precious than myth. They give us truth. Truth with chipped teeth, cracked bones, and faded paint. Truth that shows gladiators were not silent brutes. They were men. Some were volunteers. Many were slaves. Some found glory. Most found pain. They were not heroes in the modern sense. But they were remembered, at least by someone. A fellow fighter, a trainer, a fan with a piece of charcoal. In the next and final part, we will bring the story to a close. We will walk once more through the dust of the arena, but this time with all that we have learned. We will remember the gladiator not just as an image or a symbol, but as a man made of fear, flesh, and endurance, because behind the spectacle there was always a person, and behind every myth a heartbeat. The sand has settled. The last sword has fallen. The cheers have gone quiet, fading like smoke into history. There is no more training, no more clashing metal, no more blood smeared across the floor of the amphitheater. What remains now is the silence, the kind of silence that settles over old ruins and worn stones, the kind that lets you hear what noise once tried to hide. The gladiator is gone, but he was real. Not the version carved in marble or imagined on screen, but the man behind the armor, the one who woke up with aching limbs and bruised ribs, the one who squinted into the sun as he was pushed into the arena, unsure if he would live another hour, the one who ate barley and beans because that was all his body needed to bleed just a little slower, the one who was stared at, shouted at, wanted and feared, the man who dreamed of home even if he barely remembered what home meant. We have walked beside him now for 9 parts. We have felt his fear. We have seen the scars. We have heard the roar of the crowd and the heavy stillness that followed every match. And we have watched as his world changed from center of spectacle to forgotten footnote in dusty scrolls. His journey was not clean. It was not glorious. But it mattered. Because in understanding him, we understand something ancient and something deeply human. Gladiators were not born. They were made, forged in pain, trained in routine, polished for public display. Their world was shaped by empire, by power, by the insatiable Roman need to turn violence into theater. And while the crowd screamed for blood, while emperors used them as pawns in grand political games, the gladiator endured, not because he wanted to, because he had to. What surprises most people is how long that endurance stuck. Even after the games faded, even after the Colosseum began to crumble, the gladiator's image never left us. He stayed in our art, in our books, in our fantasies. He became a symbol of strength, of rebellion, of defiance, and like most symbols, he was changed. We smoothed the rough edges. We gave him dignity he was rarely allowed. We imagined him as a noble warrior, fighting for freedom, earning honor with each blow. But the truth was far messier. Most gladiators fought because they were forced to. Their victories were often small and short-lived. Their deaths were not always brave. Their lives were rarely their own. And yet, that doesn't make them any less worthy of memory. If anything, it makes them more. Because the real story of the gladiator is not one of heroism, it is one of survival, of waking up every day in a system built to break you and managing to live anyway. It is a story of men, and sometimes women, who endured not just the blade, but the boredom, the hunger, the humiliation, and the noise. They lived in a world that watched them suffer and called it sport. And somehow, they kept going. Some did find freedom. Some walked out of the ludus for the last time, holding a wooden sword and a second chance. Some found love, even if it was fleeting. Others died in the arena, face down in the dirt, with only the crowd to witness their final breath. Each life different. Each death, a line in a larger story the empire never quite finished writing. What remains of them now is scattered, a bone here, a helmet there, a name scratched into a wall that no one bothered to clean. These fragments are not grand. They do not shine, but they are honest. They tell us that these men were real, that they were more than myth, that they were not just warriors, but people flawed, scared, hungry, tired, proud. And that might be the most important thing to remember, that underneath the armor, beneath the stage lights of the Roman world, each gladiator was just a man trying not to die. Today, when we see the Colosseum, we see a monument, a symbol of Roman glory. Tourists take pictures. Guides tell stories. But look closer, listen longer. Imagine the sound of metal hitting bone, the breath of a fighter in his last minute, the moment before the gate opened, the silence afterward. That is the gladiator's truth. Not the fame, not the cheers, but the in-between, the hard mornings, the sleepless nights, the slow healing of wounds that never quite disappeared. The moments when death stood close, and you had to look it in the eye and keep moving anyway. He was not a hero in the way we like our heroes to be. He did not ride off into the sunset or win the war. He simply fought the battle right in front of him, one match at a time, one injury at a time, one choice at a time. And maybe that's enough. Maybe the lesson the gladiator leaves us is not about courage in the face of enemies, but about endurance in the face of a world that wants to use you and forget you. Maybe the story he gives us is not how to win, but how to last, how to breathe through the pain, how to hold your ground, and how to carry yourself with dignity even when the crowd only wants a show. Because the crowd always leaves, the arena always empties. But what stays, what truly matters, is the human being who stood there, bloodied, bruised, still breathing. And now, long after the gates have closed and the sand has been swept away, we remember him. Not as a champion, not as a killer, but as a man. And that, finally, is enough.